tu es d'accord pour la...
Councillor Bourgeois, do you agree with the agenda?
Monsieur Bourgeois, est-ce que vous êtes là?
Councillor Bourgeois, are you there with us? If so, we cannot hear you. Oh, there you are. Okay, hello, Daniel. We can hear you now.
You do.
Okay, merci. Next would be the adoption of the minutes for April 28th and May 26th.
Merci. Could I have a mover and a seconder for the minutes? Conseiller Kingston and Conseiller Butler, merci. And we do a manual show of hands again. So motion carried. Motion carried.
Conseiller Bourgeois, vous avez pas de change?
Councillor Bourgeois, no changes to the minutes?
Councillor Pressman has...
Yes, Councillor Prossman.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just a point of order, Councillor Kingston wasn't at the May 26th meeting, so I don't think he can move the motion. He can't move the motion, right?
Okay.
Okay, so I thought it was Kingston and,
Thank you.
okay, thank you. I can move,
Councillor Steves and Councillor Butler. C'est beau. So do we vote again? No, huh? We've already voted. So c'est bon. Merci.
Next would be new business, declaration of conflict of interest et déclaration des conflits d'intérêts.
Est-ce qu'il y a des conflits?
Any conflicts of interest? No?
Des affaires nouvelles. First up today is electronic mobility strategy, and Tim Mormon, Director of Environment Planning and Management, is here to give the presentation.
Bonjour, Monsieur Mormon.
Good afternoon, Mr. Mormon. Good afternoon to you. You can hear me? Okay. Good afternoon to all councillors, and I wish you a good Monday.
Produced. Can you hear me now? Good. Yes, produced last year and into this year. This is pursuant to, there we go. So this is a strategy to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by replacing primarily conventional internal combustion engine vehicle trip kilometers in the city of Moncton, replace them with electric modes. We did it pursuant to the Community Energy and Emissions Plan, which identified doing such a strategy as a priority measure. So the Community Energy and Emissions Plan from 2022 calls for this specifically. Transportation accounts for about 38%, depending on how you slice and dice our various emissions, about 38% of the greenhouse gas emissions originating in the city of Moncton, again, primarily because of internal combustion car trips. So obviously a priority measure. So we got Dunsky Energy and Climate Advisors to put together this study for us over the course of last year and early this year. It included some online consultation in October of 2024 into early November, asking people in Moncton for their thoughts, what they thought about electric mobility, electric micromobility, and we'll get into some of the answers on that, what we heard shortly. And there we go, there's the direction. Community-wide zero-emission vehicle strategy. We chose to interpret and expand that scope to include things like electric micromobility. This speaks to some other directions in the Community Energy and Emissions Plan, but we saw an opportunity because there was enough overlap between the two topics and a lot of the similar questions. There was an opportunity for some efficiencies there. So we rolled them both into the same study. So the survey that we undertook through Let's Chat online in late October and early November of 2024, one of the key questions was to ask people, what do you see as the biggest obstacles to electric vehicle uptake, and electric micromobility. Take a moment to make the distinction between the two. When we're talking about EVs, electric vehicles, we're talking about what you would understand as electric cars, electric trucks, road vehicles that use the street in the same way as in conventional motor vehicles, conventional gasoline-powered motor vehicles, diesel vehicles. Conversely, electric micromobility relates to things like electric assist bicycles, scooters, these smaller devices that are not, that don't use the street in the same way. They're typically for a single passenger, they're much smaller, and they are essentially not road vehicles. So just making the distinction between those two categories, which we carried forward in the discussion online. So the biggest obstacles that respondents saw to electric vehicle uptake was access to public charging. You're usually going to charge your vehicle at home, but there is a need sometimes to be able to charge up your vehicle somewhere else. If you are away from home, if you're on a long trip, what have you. And this was seen as one of the biggest obstacles. The cost of public charging was cited, and the affordability, generally meaning the upfront cost of electric vehicles. They typically sell at a premium to a comparable internal combustion vehicle. And so that was identified as one of the top three obstacles there. Also, just the availability of the vehicles has been an issue. Questions about having charging at home and support programs. Meanwhile, when we're talking about electric micromobility, so scooters and things like that, the two biggest obstacles that were cited were well-designed routes and safe routes. These kind of overlap, actually. Well-designed routes take you to where you want to go easily, and safe routes are the routes that you feel safe and don't feel that you're going to be injured or killed using them. And the third biggest obstacle was parking, where to put those electric vehicles when you arrive at your destination, somewhere secure to lock them to, somewhere that they will be out of the elements, where you don't have to worry about them being stolen. So those are the top three. Also questions of weather and terrain. Generally a sense of car culture, generally a sense that cars are considered dominant and people not using them are very much in the minority for now. The affordability of the devices was also an issue, and just generally accessibility and comfort. So this kind of gave us a picture of what people saw as the biggest problems, the biggest obstacles, and where we should concentrate our efforts in terms of improving electric mobility uptake. And so the biggest recommendations, the main recommendations that come out of the report are, first of all, in the domain of regulations, reviewing of bylaws to ensure access and safety for e-bike users, as well as for e-micromobility. So this is generally about things like building into bylaws requirements for storage and locking parking facilities, things like that. And just generally looking at our bylaws to ensure that our regulations on the use of roads and other bylaws applicable in the city properly address these devices, because right now they exist in somewhat of a gray area. They're not directly spoken to for the most part by municipal bylaws. And they also talked about things like siting and design guidelines for public chargers. If the city is going to install electric mobility or electric vehicle chargers, or to require them in new development, we want to make sure that they are designed in a way that they are easy to use, that they are accessible, that they are convenient for the users. There's also a recommendation to continue installing public charging to fill sort of the network gaps. They talk about the fast chargers, the very fast chargers that let you charge a vehicle in a matter of minutes or under an hour. These should be available on something like a 2-kilometer grid within the city, whereas the somewhat slower chargers, the level 2 chargers that will charge it in the matter of a few hours, are best installed generally within about 500 meters of where someone is going to need them. So a 5 to 10 minute walk, and that we should continue to install these until we've reached something like that level of saturation. In terms of just spending programs, infrastructure programs, a very strong recommendation was complete streets and active transportation infrastructure, continuing to invest in this. The electric micromobility devices in particular are going to use, or should be using, essentially the same facilities as cyclists do. So the absence of, or the perceived absence of convenient and safe routes being a big obstacle there, addressing that would also go a long way towards some of our other goals, such as encouraging just typical conventional active transportation like cycling. It's worth taking this moment just as an aside to underscore the fact that electric mobility is definitely an important part of the solution. Electric vehicles are a big part of our solution going forward. But the single best thing we can do to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions related to transportation in the city of Moncton is to make it easy and convenient and safe for people to choose not to drive at all, encouraging active transportation modes. So there is kind of a double win there in improving the facilities for electric micromobility. It also serves the conventional muscle-powered active transportation users as well. And finally, a suite of advocacy and information recommendations, educating residents about micromobility, as well as various lobbying and advocacy efforts directed at the federal and provincial government levels to get legislative changes that make it easier for us to get the goals, achieve the goals that we need to achieve. So some of this is not a comprehensive list. This is just the stuff that jumped out at me as being particularly interesting. Now, the electric vehicle fleet in New Brunswick has nearly doubled every year since 2021. I think in Q3 of 2024, about 7% of vehicles sold in New Brunswick were electric vehicles. That was higher than I expected. I was surprised to hear that. We also expect that electric vehicle uptake is going to increase even without federal and provincial subsidies. Now, at the time that we were getting this study done, there was certainly federal mandates, various programs and various targets, but we were acutely aware at the time that government policy can change, and so we shouldn't be counting on those things to continue into the future. So we asked the consultants to not assume that those subsidies would continue. And their projections suggest that we would continue to see EV uptake even without those subsidies. Subsidies obviously are going to help. They're going to make things easier. They're going to make it more affordable. But we should not expect that this was entirely dependent on subsidies. The momentum seems there. One question that was really interesting to me to find the answer to was that electric vehicles do in fact offer meaningful greenhouse gas reductions by up to 3/4, 80% of the emissions of a comparable internal combustion vehicle. It's important, and I'm taking the time to emphasize it here because there is often a misunderstanding that an electric vehicle simply moves the greenhouse gas emissions upstream to where the power is generated. And to a certain extent, there are some greenhouse gas emissions that come from the power plant where the electricity that charges a vehicle is produced. But the overall efficiencies of the vehicles themselves, the relatively clean mix of electricity that we currently have in New Brunswick and is expected to get cleaner, means that there are not just small improvements by going with an electric vehicle, but significant ones. Large fractions of the greenhouse gas emissions are removed. So that's a good thing. One of the big takeaways was that the city should start to require electric vehicle ready parking spaces, not necessarily the chargers themselves, but having the wiring, the conduits, the ability to install them as the need emerges in new development, particularly as part of any parking facility provided with a multi-unit development, because while it's relatively easy for you to arrange for charging if you're in a ground-oriented house, it's harder if you live in an apartment, as well as in commercial development. So that is something that it would be very timely as we're going into the municipal development plan review and the zoning bylaw review. That's something that we would, that is a question that would be wholly appropriate for that process and those documents. So, more on that in the coming months. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, the improvements to the active transportation network and upgrades to SAME pay off double benefits, not just encouraging people to use conventional active transportation, but also helping to encourage the uptake of electric micromobility and broadening the range of safe, convenient, and pleasant options for people who are deciding to get where they're going without having to drive a car. And with that, I will thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Tim. Any questions from colleagues? I don't see any. Conseiller Bourgeois, no. No. Conseiller Léger.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks for the overview. I'm just wondering, sort of the next steps, maybe the action items. I mean, they're all great statements and so on, but how do we start to build them in? For example, I've had a number of people indicate that some other municipalities have changed their building, not so much the building code, but requirements that, for example, when you build an apartment, a certain percentage of chargers have to be built into that new development and so on. And some of those things that maybe the municipality can be involved in a proactive way, whether that's an incentive and so on, and just your comments on that.
Absolutely. Well, on that particular example, that is something that I will be bringing in some detail to the Plan Review Committee and Municipal Development Plan process. I think it is. It was gratifying to see that kind of reconfirmed in the consultant's report. It was something that I suspected was very, very much appropriate. I think there's a lot that we could do with that. When we're talking about multi-unit development, when parking is provided, arranging for a certain amount of it to have to be EV ready is something that only makes sense. Over time, we're going to have more and more electric vehicles. They are going to make up more and more of the fleet, and we should not assume that they're all going to be in ground-oriented houses. So that's something that we'll be looking into in much more detail. When it comes to commercial development, the recommendation was to have 20 to 40% of the parking spaces be EV ready. I think that there's a bit of nuance that can be applied to that. I would suggest that when we are talking about large regional draws that are drawing people from well outside of Moncton and coming a long distance, I think it would almost be more important to ensure that those have some, not that it's not important elsewhere, but it would be more important to ensure that they have some electric vehicle charging ability to help encourage people who might have range anxiety or return anxiety living farther afield to know that if they come to Moncton to shop or to do business or what have you, that there are opportunities here for them to charge their vehicles. So there's a lot of kind of thought to get into, a lot of detail to get into. This study was a very high level and lean study. We wanted to, first and foremost, get somebody to tell us what is known about this new area of public policy, and then from there we can drill down into the details of it, and look forward to doing so.
Okay, it sounds good. Another thought too would be when we are looking at a new subdivision, why couldn't there be a requirement of having designated charging stations built in that development as a requirement, similar to our streets and so on? So maybe something that could be looked at as well to sort of facilitate it. And then lastly, I think our commitment as a city to install chargers in all our facilities, Coliseum, for example, places, Avenir Center. I don't know if we have them yet at the Avenir Center. Don't know. Anyway, those are things, and maybe that's what I mean about action items is maybe, understanding what the landscape is and then having proactive ways that we encourage this to happen, because a lot of it will happen on its own, but it will be a lot slower than if we have a purpose. So, thank you.
Merci.
Merci, conseiller Léger. Excellente question. Conseiller Bourgeois. C'est bon.
Thank you very much. That was an excellent question. Councillor Bourgeois now? You can hear me? Yes, we can hear you. And we can see you on screen as well. Okay, thank you. I have two questions. My first one is a concern that has been expressed by several citizens, including two with reduced mobility. The question is, what can we do to prevent e-bikes from using the sidewalk, and even worse, from being left there parked on the sidewalk? When people are done using their e-bike, they just leave it there on the sidewalk. So people with reduced mobility, for example, people in wheelchairs, they can't get up to move the e-bike that's blocking the way for them on the sidewalk. So what can they do? They can't go around the e-bike if it's left on the sidewalk. What can we do about this situation? Can it be fines? What could we do? Thank you, Counselor, for this very good question. Currently, we still have a little bit of interdepartmental work to do in order to answer that question. Moreover, it is expected that there would be a bylaw presented to council, I'd say in the next few weeks. And in other words, we're working on bylaws to address this problem. It wasn't part of this study. Like I said, it was a very high level study, but we do know that attention needs to be brought to the issue. So there's more to come. Okay, more to come in the future. That's great. My second question now. The consultants who did this study, I wonder actually if staff has thought about this. If everybody were to rent e-bikes, that's one thing, but people will surely start purchasing them as well to move around the city. Is there parking in the downtown area for people who would buy their own e-bikes? How can we encourage this type of parking? And actually, not just for e-bikes, but for bikes in general. When I was in Malmo in Sweden and in Copenhagen in Denmark, this was 3 years ago, I was there for a conference on climate. And at that time, there was covered parking. It was approximately 100 by 60 meters, several places in the downtown area. And this was reserved parking for bikes, whether traditional bikes or e-bikes. So is this something that is included in the plan, in the revision? What are your thoughts on this? It's certainly something that I would like to bring to the table when we will be discussing the municipal plan. I've seen the same thing when I studied in Denmark. So Scandinavian countries certainly accommodate bicycles and micromobility a lot better than we do here in North America. This is change that we should look into, and we should accelerate this kind of change. So your question is not just with regard to conventional bicycles, but also with regard to electric vehicles, and this will just increase availability for everybody, will improve the situation for everybody. There is a diversity of vehicles, of micromobility and bicycles, and we know that they're not all of the same size, they don't all have the same shape. An e-bike can easily be parked on a traditional bike rack. However, we see more and more that there are like the backfeeds that we have here in the downtown area. They're larger bikes that are made to transport groceries, for example, and these larger bikes are a little bit more difficult to park in a traditional bike rack. So that's something that we need to look into. And the same thing when we talk about an e-cargo bike. So it's certainly something that needs to be investigated. We need to see how many of these spaces would be needed, and so on and so forth. So many questions to ask. So how many parkings for cars? It's a question we need to ask as well. How many parking spots do you need for cars versus for bicycles, etc. So a lot of mobility questions need to be answered still. Excellent. Yeah, because it's not just for new developments, that's easy to include there, but what do we do right now with existing spots, with the industrial park, with the downtown area? There are several people who might want to use their bicycles or their e-vehicles, and right now they might feel that they need to bring it inside the building so it doesn't get stolen. So if there was a place for them to park their bikes or their e-bikes somewhere safe, especially in the downtown area, this would be great to consider. Thank you very much. Councillor Kingston now. Thank you very much, Your Worship.
Category I find interesting, Tim, because as we travel around the city more and more, we see the drop-off zones. It's through the app. They're all over the place, very simple to get through the app to pick up and continue and leave. Helmets are not required at this time, I don't think, but that's under discussion by council, I believe, on the bylaw side. But do you anticipate an explosion of use on the scooter side? And I guess the B part would be, they're often on the Riverfront Trail, and they're very silent, as you know, and they fly by it. I think they can do it at a max of 30 kilometers per hour. So they are moving at a clip, helmetless drivers, of course, with no bells or whistles on there either. So it's a safety issue combined with that, but I anticipate an explosion in the use of that, and I wonder if you feel the same way.
These are all good questions. I wouldn't try to speculate on how much uptake we're likely to see on these, but it's certainly the issues you've identified and others as well are certainly they certainly need to be addressed. And our interdepartmental working group has been on this for a few months now, actually.
Right.
Kind of trying to foresee the various issues that we're going to have to take care of. So it is being given a lot of thought, but really the points you've raised are just a few of them. So
It's a quick mode of getting around the city, and I was made aware of an accident. Really, a young gentleman fell off the scooter at about 25 kilometers per hour, sustained a number of cuts and bruises, scrapes, not seriously hurt, but still, the fact that he flew off that scooter at a pretty good clip is an indication that the element is there for those. Anyway, thank you, Tim. Merci beaucoup. Thank you, Madame Addis.
Il n'y a pas d'autres questions. Merci beaucoup, Tim. Merci.
Merci, Madame Maras.
Very much, Your Worship. Madam Clerk?
Response. I believe Jeff Preston, our General Manager, Protective Services, is going to introduce this.
Bonjour, Jeff.
Bonjour. Thank you. So I'm here to talk about the encampment response protocol policy. And then I'll kind of go over a little bit of the background, how we got here. It's a slight overview of the policy. And then if we have questions regarding the application of the policy, the chief is here to help me out, hopefully. In consultation with the legal department, and we felt it was necessary to bring forward to council a policy for their approval to ensure this council is fully aware of the current approach. And the reason to bring this forward is we want to ensure that the proposed policy is robust, legally defensible, and compliant. A well-defined policy endorsed by council provides a standardized framework that helps mitigate risks by guiding staff actions and setting clear expectations. Also, an improved policy ensures a unified and consistent approach across multiple departments, as we do have multiple departments that are involved in dealing with these encampments. A formally approved policy provides clear guidelines not only for municipal staff, but also for encampment residents, advocacy groups, and the general public as well. This clarity helps manage expectations, facilitates constructive dialogue, ensures that everyone understands the municipality's stance and the procedures regarding encampments. Shelley, do I have the presentation there?
Justin?
It's okay if I don't, but I'll keep going, and if it comes up, it's so one of the things that we wanted to do, and we started early this year, was to really assess what we were currently doing and bring in our stakeholder groups to have a conversation with them to get their input on what we are currently doing and if changes needed to be made. So we brought in community policing, RCMP, shelter operators, as well as the province of New Brunswick, and really had a roundtable discussion on what we are currently doing. Are there things that we should change? Are modification necessary? We worked with this group and helped really form the basis of this policy. And as I said, really this policy that you have before you really encompasses what the current practice have been and are currently are. So we wanted a policy that provides a framework that was built on principles of respect, compassion, and collaborative approach. You'll see that that's well articulated in the policy, and it's there because it's very important, right? This is not about generating compliance at all costs. It's about working with everyone that's involved, both residents of encampments as well as citizens. Also, the goal at the end of the day is try to help these individuals and get the assistance they need and get the proper supports so that everyone can enjoy public spaces. The guiding principles obviously are, the trust, treat everyone with respect and understanding, recognizing the importance of a trauma-informed approach to generate that compliance. Provide accessible public spaces for everyone to enjoy. Collaborate with partners continuously and evaluate and improve the process. We understand that these things change constantly, and we have to be flexible and able to make changes when necessary and continuously self-evaluate how we're handling these situations. And understand that while policies and guidelines are important, the best decisions are often made by frontline employees who are empowered to use their judgment and understanding to align with the overall policy's intent. So really balancing achieving compliance, but also understanding what our goals are. A big part of it is also community consultation. We want to continue to work with our partners in the community, outreach shelter providers, the YMCA program, the provincial government, and we want to be constantly self-evaluating and evolving. We work collaboratively with our partners to address challenges and find effective solutions because we know, as I said, the situation changes constantly. There's always new variables being thrown, and we have to be dynamic. Strive for continuous improvement, adaptability, recognizing the environment and the challenges that we're in. So as we move forward, we'll continue our collaboration and dialogue with our partners and look forward for ways to improve what we do and how we do it. We'll be flexible in our approach and again, committed to achieving our goals and with understanding and compassion. So that's it.
Merci beaucoup, Jeff. Questions? We do have a motion, so I need a mover and a seconder. Conseiller Butler, do you wish
Yes, I can move it.
to move? And seconded, Conseiller Regis? OK, c'est bon. Donc, Conseiller Butler.
Thank you, Your Worship, and thanks, Jeff, for the presentation. The only issue that I have with this, anyway, I didn't, maybe everybody else got, I didn't get no presentation. I just got,
okay.
just got the policy. Is that what he was talking about, or?
Yep, the policy, yep.
Okay, so, yeah, I got that. There's no presentation. The only thing that I don't know if you'd say disagree with, but maybe we're not talking enough about are the people that, you know, we have these encampments, but we've, as you well know, the people we get the call from are the citizens that have lived there their whole life, and then all of a sudden, you know, they leave a shovel out or a rake out or a bicycle out, it's gone, or their propane is gone out of their barbecue. So, you know, one thing about this policy, it only mentions very, very little about the victims. It's more about the people that move in and that are having mental issues or drug issues or are homeless. But, you know, we can't forget about the other side, the victims, and them are the people that we've had a number of open houses where we've gone and spoke to them in the West End, the North End, over in Louisville, Sunnybrae area. And, you know, these people have, in the schools even. So I think that, you know, I agree with the respect and dignity and all of that. I really do. But I think that, you know, one of the things that I would be thinking about that, you know, we have enough technology to know where the encampments are. I think that at least what we should be doing is maybe letting the people, like, you know, we go to build a home or build an apartment building, we got to put this great big sign up what's coming. But, you know, people are living in certain areas and they don't even know there's an encampment in the woods behind them. So I think people should be well aware of what's going on so they can do their own part. You know, if you don't know there's something going on, you're not going to lock your door, you're not going to lock your shed or your car. So I think, you know, I really wish that there was just if we have this for encampments, maybe we should have some type of policy of how we treat the victims of what's happening around them, because they really are affected. I can remember a couple of years ago in the West End, I think it was Councillor Legier and Councillor Bourgeois that put that together, and you know, people were really, really, really upset. So anyway, just your views. Maybe have some.
Yeah, so just on the whole policy, this policy is really about the response to the encampments, and what we've seen in legislation across the country being challenged from different angles is you know, in consultation with the legal department, is about formulating a response protocol that we feel is defensible. And one of the things, all the key elements that are in here are really those things that we've seen from across the country about the best practices, both from a legal perspective and operational. They're incorporated in there. And the comment in there about the public spaces are for everyone, I know that's not that's a broad-based comment, but that's really what it is, because people have different views. I mean, you look across the country, people have different views about public spaces and whether or not encampments should be allowed in them. We, to this point, have taken the position that they should not be. So that's a fine line to walk, and that's why it's not in there to that part of it. But as far as the victims or residents should assume that there are encampments around and they need to keep everything locked, because I mean, there is a lot of activity in the city. There's no bones about that. I mean, the chief may want to comment to some aspect of it, but yeah, so that's why it's not in this policy. This policy is specific to the response to the encampments.
Yeah, but when we look at that then, Jeff, then maybe, you know, the rest of the country's got it wrong if that's all they're talking about. You know, in fairness to your committee for putting it together, you know, it's the same one that's across Canada. But the point being is that we're still not dealing with the people. So if you have an encampment and you don't get no complaints, we really don't even know it's there. I guess for garbage wise, you see people that maybe sometimes it's on private property or whatever, but we still go back to the victims or the residents, you know, that are near that all of a sudden, you know, for years and years they've lived there and nothing has happened, and all of a sudden every morning they go out, there's something missing. I think there's, you know, we have to be able to go into the neighborhoods, I think, and explain to them before it gets out of hand what we're doing for them. Like, we're doing a lot for the people that have all the issues, but we're not, it doesn't seem like we're trying to get ahead of what's happening in a neighborhood.
Well, I mean, I think we're fairly aggressive in our approach in dealing with encampments. And, you know, encampment residents aren't happy when they get the 24-hour or 48-hour notice to vacate. And we have obviously some interactions that don't always go well. But we do try to stay on it, fairly active. And I mean, if you were to look at the kind of heat map of where a majority of encampments and the calls to service are, they are predominantly in the downtown area where people just set up on someone's front corner of their lawn. I mean, there are some in the suburbs, but the majority are in the downtown core. And those are active, and we stay on them as quickly as we can before people get entrenched, right?
Yeah, listen, this is certainly not on staff. I'm just saying that, you know, the residents are the ones that complain, and they're the ones that are victimized when, you know, when you're onto, you know, I've spoken here before about this, when you're addicted to drugs and you don't work, nobody gives you drugs. You have to steal to get something to be able to sell to somebody to get money to do your thing, right? They're chasing that high. And usually it's the people in them subdivisions. So when you say it's just downtown, I was just by the Battery House the other day, and there were 6 of them lined up there on the side in the shade, and they were all doing the needles. So, you know, it's everywhere.
Yeah, well, absolutely.
Yeah.
I just mean proportionally, we get
Yeah.
more, where there's more issues in the downtown core than there is in the outlying areas. But absolutely.
Yeah.
And sometimes we've had cases where encampments have existed for a long time, no complaints from the residents, and people saw someone going into the woods where, you know, and those ones are difficult, because if we move that person, they might be going to your backyard next, right? So it's a very difficult game to manage. The big solution to this is housing and all those things that we talked about in previous conversations about upstream, finding the addiction services, the mental health services. That's the real solution. We're dealing with the symptoms of all these things, right?
Well, couldn't agree more. Anyway, thank you. Thank you, Your Worship.
Merci, Conseiller Butler. Conseiller Richard.
Merci, Madame Stereo. Thanks, Jeff, for the explanation on the policy there. Under reporting.
Yep.
Doesn't define when or how often council would be hearing updates. So it says that they'll be meeting weekly.
Oh yeah, that's the oversight group. We meet weekly on Tuesdays,
Okay, so
the team.
that's what that's about.
Yep.
Because
Yep.
you're mentioning as well that external agencies, clarify what other,
So,
How's that
so our
developed?
weekly Tuesday call, social issues that has existed before I took on this role. There is shelter operators, the province of New Brunswick, community policing, our own staff, and different various organizations come and go on that as needed. But that's really I call it the oversight committee, really, for the whole social issues in the greater Moncton area.
okay. I just needed some clarification on that. Thank you.
C'est tout, Conseiller Richard. Avez-vous? Non, pas d'autres questions. Conseiller Crossman.
Thank you, Your Worship. Jeff, thanks for the presentation. I had few concerns as along the same lines as Councillor Butler with regards to the community and the residents around the areas that are seeing theft go up and so on and so forth, and the encampments coming in. Do you happen to know how much we spend on cleaning up encampments within the run of a year? City taxpayer dollar?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen it vary over the years, Counselor. I believe when the year that we had the mud shock and that large encampment, I think it went up upwards of 700,000, but somewhere's in the vicinity of 400 to half a million.
Okay, that's what we spend on
Cleaning.
cleaning up.
Yep, yep.
Okay, and do we know how much we spend per year on social issues, to your point of mental health addiction?
Yeah, I don't have the number. I mean, it's upwards of 5. Like, Isabel, do you have an idea? Jacques would have a better idea, but we have put that together and we can get that for council and provide them work with finance. And because that would be, at times we've included the money to Rising Tides, the 19 community officers and the cleanup and all of those programs, right?
Right, the DMCI.
Yep, the whole thing.
Everything would be included, okay.
Yep.
It's just, that's all coming out of city budget. That's all.
Right.
That's all taxpayers' money that's going
Yep.
into the system that's supporting that. Okay, good. You did mention throughout your report in the CRF, you talked about stakeholders.
Yep.
And you mentioned a few of them this afternoon at the mic. The province of New Brunswick, you did mention social development is involved with this as well, so that when they come back to council, they're under the same impression that council members are under on this policy?
Yep, they've been
Okay.
made aware of.
So they're aware of it.
decisions. Yep.
Okay, perfect. So thank you for that. I just have a couple of more questions. I guess one would be when you get on site of one of these campsites. I know over the weekend, or maybe it would have been Thursday or Friday, there was a posting on social media, which you can never guarantee is correct. But there was a huge encampment fire, is the way that it was listed on social media. Was that true?
I'll let the chief speak to that, the guy
Okay.
with the stripes.
Okay. And I do have a question for the chief as well when he gets to the mic.
Madame la Mairesse Adjointe, Councillor Crosman. So we did get a number of fires this weekend, but wasn't a large encampment on fire. There was one was a garbage bin and one was some brushes and all that was on fire.
Okay, because the one that really got a lot of uptake with regards to the fire department as well was the one behind, I'm gonna say, St. Hubert or somewhere in that area that seemed to be an encampment. And
Correct.
the response by the fire department was what was the focus.
Correct.
So are our trucks guaranteed to get on site? Are we able to actually put out fires that are started in encampments that could danger communities? How quick can we respond?
So depending on how far it is in the woods we would treat this as a grass fire or something like that. So we do have the backpacks and we do have hoses and pumps that we can get in the woods. So it really depends on the distance.
Okay, and what about obstacles that our firefighters would be encountering as they go through this? I've heard of bear traps. I've heard of zip lines that are, at ankle level throughout all these encampments. Is any of this correct? How much of this information should we be sharing?
So there is some, the bear trap was true. The bylaw officers found a bear trap there. There is some areas that they've, if you want to call booby trap their area, not just for firefighters, but for they're protecting their area. So we did find some case of that. So we are training our firefighters and bylaw officers to make sure that they're extra cautious when they do respond. And if there's any time they're in doubt, they call the RCMP for assistance.
Okay, good. Thank you, Chief. I appreciate it. Those are my only questions for you. Jeff, just going through this, again, I just want to make sure the province of New Brunswick is involved in this because throughout the documents, I don't see PMB mentioned, but I just want to confirm that they are included.
Yeah, our local rep from SD has been involved and aware of the policy. At the end of the day, it's up to every municipality to decide how they want to deal with these encampment responses. I don't think ours is identical to St. John or Fredericton's or others, right? So,
Right.
but yes.
Okay, good. And continuous improvement. Councillor Richard took my question on reporting.
Yep.
So continuous improvement, you talk about it. How often are you going to be effective and feedback from stakeholders as you outlined?
Pretty much weekly or daily. I mean,
Okay.
one of the things, I'm relatively new to this, but it's always asking questions on how can we do things better. And one of the things that I've learned early on is there's no solutions. There's only every day trying to make things a little bit better. And that's the way that you stay in the race, is just, otherwise you get worn down. People get worn down. And they are making a difference every day, our staff. And all these agencies, and it's just continuously working at it and asking the questions like, are there things that we can do better? Are there things that we can do differently? And being open to that, being open to criticism, being open to suggestions, and that's what we do. And that's why the policy is not 400 pages long, because it will change. There'll be addendums, there'll be improvements. Council may decide, or the next, council may decide they're going to allow a encampment somewhere. I don't know. So that's why we're where we are. This is really a starting piece, a framework as we called it, so.
Okay. I only had two more questions. One, you just answered, that this is a living document.
Yes.
We can change this, we can modify this, depending on the situations we're in, similar to what COVID did to our housing industry, right? I mean, they're in our growth pattern.
Yeah, and the beautiful thing about this is it comes back to council. If we make changes to the policy, it has to come back to council. So again, we'll have that dialogue of this very important issue that to Councillor Butler's, affects every citizen of Moncton. This is a topic of conversation. We all know, I get it too, right? Everywhere I go.
Yeah.
So yeah, absolutely living document.
And my only last question, and I'll close on this, is I know that I've asked for it, Councillor Bourgeois has asked for it, the acting mayor has asked for this. We'd like to get a list of the nonprofits, exactly how much funding goes to the nonprofits, what their rules and responsibilities are, back to the city of Moncton. I don't want to micromanage this, but in the CRF, and I always print the CRF when I have questions, in the financial, we're talking about this spending money in the future, right? In possible budgets to support such a policy. So I'm asking that again. I'm going to go on record again to ask, how do we get that information so the council can understand exactly what's going on that affects this policy through the nonprofits?
Yeah, I believe that it was a couple of council, maybe a public session of council ago, or maybe it was committee of the whole, myself and Isabel LeBlanc. We're going to work through that with Vince Marola. It's not an easy task to go through all of those, but I think that it's important to have that snapshot of how this all works, because I think it is quite complex. Probably one of the reasons why sometimes there are issues, because of that complexity, right, of all those intertwined agencies.
Okay, I'd like to see that. So I don't want to put a time frame on it. You say it's complex, but do you think we'll get it before fall?
Isabel,
maybe
do you have any
October?
comment, Isabel?
The only reason why I'm asking, Isabel, is because we keep talking about this, but we have no hard evidence to.
Yeah, so we've had two requests. One is a list as to what you're asking for. The other one, which is the complex part, is the how everything speaks to others. And so that is a little more complicated, because some services offer things to many organizations. And anyway, so it's a little complex to get that organogram done, but a list with who are they, what do they do, the who, what, when, where, why, and how much funding they get from the city, that we can get relatively quickly. So I would say we'll see if Vincent is on vacation, but we can get that certainly in the next 2-3 weeks for sure.
Okay, good. Thank you, Your Worship.
Merci, Conseiller Crossman, Conseiller Radjet.
Merci, Madame la Mairesse Adjointe. My question, or I was looking at the tolerance and prioritization, Jeff, and I understand indicating that a compassionate and flexible approach may be taken in less visible locations, and that makes sense. Obviously, the visible ones are the ones we hear about and that we need to have more action on. But I'm just wondering if there is a protocol. The concerns for fires and garbage and danger and that sort of thing have already been brought up by other councillors. And is there a protocol in place in order to know when the intervention needs to come? Because I understand having a policy like that makes sense. Be flexible, be compassionate. And I agree, if there's two people out in the vision lands getting along and not doing drugs and they're just managing somehow, it's very inoffensive to most people. But it would seem that longer people stay in the woods and establish themselves there, they need access to making their own food, so then they're having fires, or they need it for heat in the winter or whatever. So there's always these dangers in that way. But then let's talk about the garbage and the sewage, like it's just happening as we go forward. So is there a protocol that once you've identified a camp area, like do you have a map or something? And you go, we've been there on the 4th of July and we need someone to go back there on the 27th of July because it's been 3 weeks or something like that. I'm just wondering if that's a type of detail that you would go into, or is that something that could be recommended?
Thank you, Councilor Edgett. So yeah, absolutely. We do have, that Tuesday morning, we do review the map.
Right.
So again, this is, the only ones that we map out is the ones we know. So anytime we get a complaint or on a bylaw officer notices an encampment, they document it. And while they're there, they're gonna assess. If they see evidence of a fire, then that's gonna put it in a priority to clean up, or if they see propane tanks or stuff like that. And depends where it is and the complainant. We'll always give them some time. So at the very minimum, if it's immediate life and a situation, they have to clean it right away. But if sometimes, most of the time, we're going to give them at least 24 hours to clean it up. But yeah, every time it is mapped and it's dated from the time was noticed and the time was cleaned up. And then we have at the very least 3 times a week we do clean up the sites, and we keep track of all the sites.
Yeah, okay. And a lot of the biggest fears is forest fires. I mean, we're so fortunate that we're not dealing with what we have to deal with others out west, but it's still a fear we all have. And we have so many forests around us.
And the Reconnect, so there's some sites that we're not aware of because Reconnect knows them. So there was an education program for them to say, listen, here are the consequences. And they actually had a fire extinguisher program. They were donating fire extinguisher to these folks. So Reconnect is reaching out and educating, but there's still, unfortunately, some fires there. So we're trying to be diligent on it.
Yes, I always have a problem with us offering support, like the support to be in the encampment. I was never in favor of the encampment that we did support in the beginning, and providing a fire extinguisher is a safety measure, and yes, we should probably do that. But when we start providing more services, providing water and porta potties and all this sort of thing, well then I think we're taking away our energies that we should be focusing on exactly what we are good at, is getting people housing, getting people the services they need, finding out why they're there, and getting them out of there. And so I hope we're not headed down that road.
So just so we're clear, we're not giving any, it's the Reconnect outreach. It's the YMCA that's doing all those initiatives. Our number one intervention is always recommending to go to the hub and then getting resources.
Yeah.
And whenever if there's a citizen that requests them moved, we collaborate with the RCMP and they are moved and it's clean. If a citizen says, don't want them on my land, then that's right away. And if they're on our land, public property, then that's the same process. So it just sometimes private property said, no, it doesn't matter to me, then we're limited to what we can do.
And I'm sure in my mind, there's over 700 people out on the streets. I'm sure many of you know a lot of their names, and you follow them and you have concerns for them, and you're trying to get them in the system, shall we say, and get the help they need and that sort of thing. So I know I can't imagine the people that are in this service line are not very conscious of the people that are out there and trying to protect them.
And that's the good or bad, I guess. They get to know them on a first name basis, and they know who needs immediate help.
Yeah.
And we'll report that to Reconnect also. So there's that Tuesday morning is so important, but they interact on a daily basis. But that Tuesday morning, we're gonna, hey, by the way, there's an encampment here. Reconnect will say, hey, yeah, we're working with them there. And they'll even tell, yeah, there's a place on the shelter. We have a house for this person. So we have all those types of conversations. So, but it is a complex situation.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate you sharing that type of information with us. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Conseiller Steves.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Thank you, Jeff. Most of my questions have been answered. I do have one, and perhaps this is just a reminder for you to remind us, and if you're not able to do this, if this isn't memorized, then you could perhaps send this to us later. But on page 2, in the fourth part of the policy, it says private property outreach and communication. The city's partnered with YMCA, Reconnect Alternative Dispatch Outreach Program. They're the primary point of contact for individuals. Is there a structure that, who oversees the YMCA Reconnect? Who are they answering to?
So Shannon Berry is in charge of the program, but again, we are working as partners. Shannon's on that Tuesday call. We're having those conversations with encampments, the current situation, whether it's escalating or not escalating. And yeah, so I would say the YRAD program itself is being funded out of the CRPA, out of the RCMP money. That's where that came through in that budget. So that's really a pilot program that was approved for this year. And those numbers, so when you call 85333, they will be directing that call to YRAD.
So this policy, does it cover them? You talk about legally is one of the reasons why we have this policy. Does this policy cover the YMCA Reconnect?
Nick, I don't know. Provide an answer.
Thank you. No, I mean, the policy applies to city administration. That's the purpose of it, to define what our roles and responsibilities are and to outline the process. And then those other stakeholders would be just part of that process, but it doesn't bind them in any way.
Okay, so the city's moving it to YMCA Reconnect to deal with. So bylaw officers, when do they don't go on site anymore?
No, I would say majority of times bylaw officers are on site for the majority of those calls. It's just sometimes those calls, depending on the situation, may get redirected to YRAD, or bylaw may show up and say, we're also going to call YRAD on the scene. So we're going to give the notice, and we're also going to bring, because YRAD is really the person that's going to help them in the outreach side. Go to the hub. Here's a number you can call. These are the people. So they're the ones that are starting that whole intake process with these individuals, right? So that's their role in it. For instance, sometimes we'll get phone calls if someone on the street may look in distress. It may not be a 911 call per se. And what we're working towards is trying to get YRAD to respond to some of those calls, so that, you know, you see that person that looks somewhat in distress. So they're showing up and asking the person, what can we do for it? Instead of sending a fire truck and an ambulance and the RCMP, if it's not needed, right?
So I guess ultimately then what I'm saying is, if this is a reboot and we're refreshing the policy, would it be wise to have some sort of structure or an additional appendix to this? That what if somebody on the Reconnect team does something wrong that the city wouldn't have approved of? Isn't that what this policy is preparing for? Is legally, I keep hearing the word legally, what if something goes wrong in the pecking order of doing this with the wonderful respect and all of the words that are being used here? What if that doesn't happen?
Ultimately, we're responsible for what our bylaw officers are involved in, and the policy is to outline their interaction and how we're going to deal with the encampment. I see the YRAD program as a co piece to it, not them leading necessarily. I mean, I'll be on. Well, the chief already alluded to it. I mean, there's encampments that we're not aware of, and they're not. The YMCA is not necessarily going to tell us until there's an issue, and that's about trust. That's about a whole lot of things with those individuals that are out there, and we have to navigate that. I think we've gone a long way working with the Y teams and those outreach programs, and they realize that they can have a conversation with us, and we aren't going to run in there like with gusto and making decisions without having a collaborative conversation about how we're going to deal with this. I mean, don't forget, when we have large encampments, when you dismantle an encampment, they're going somewheres. They're not going into houses because we don't have enough housing. We know that. We've had that conversation in presentations to council. So every action in this whole thing has an equal and opposite reaction. So this policy is really based on fundamental principles, best practice, what we've seen across the country, and allowing council in the city of Moncton to have a defensible policy that legal is comfortable with and our departments are comfortable with and our team is comfortable with in really providing.
Yeah, I understand it's complex. For me, I can't speak for the other counselors. I don't fully understand the interconnectedness. And if there was some sort of chart or a graphic that could help portray that in this fresh reboot, I'm making that suggestion.
I think it's fluid, Counselor, and I don't think we're ready to totally define it because I think it's evolving. I mentioned about the trust factor with the YMCA program. I think we're gaining trust, and so I think it's fluid, those relationships.
Okay. Okay.
Well, no, and I mentioned it. I think that a broader aspects and some aspects here allow room for discretion, room for decision in the application of this policy. And I think that's what it needs, as opposed to defining every action.
Thank you.
Merci, Conseiller Steves. Conseiller Léger.
Merci, Madame la Mairesse. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Steves. Councillor Léger now.
Would it be useful, do you think, since we're creating this policy and in terms of trying to standardize, that we ask the YMCA what their policy is and how, because they would obviously be wanting to make sure that their care and the way they do things is standardized and it blends in with what our expectations are. So I can't speak for them, but I would think that as an organization, they would, seeing what we're doing, they would want, or they already have a policy that would protect them as well.
Oh, I assume, and I can't speak to it, but I assume an operation as large as the YMCA would definitely have safe work practices and directives and understand what the risks are going into those encampments.
So perhaps as an appendix, that could be added to our policy since they're mentioned as a partner in what we're doing. Just food for thought.
I'll let Nick, I think Nick wants to say something.
I probably wouldn't attach it to our policy because then every time their policy changes, we have to come back to council to get it reapproved to add it as an appendix. But I mean, we can verify that they have a policy and we could send whatever it is to council for your information.
Okay, that would be good. It's not to overthink it, but it's just to make sure that they're in sync with what we're doing. So, I'm wondering there's a couple things in the policy. I'll bring it up here. You talked about the property owner engagement. So, and it says here, the city may contact property owners to inform them of reported concerns regarding the encampment. How often does that happen in terms of follow-up and feedback when encampments in close to proximity of residents, there's action taken upon them?
Chief.
Thank you, Councilor Legier. So if I understand the question is, so once we've cleaned up, how often do we contact the homeowner saying the complainant? That's an area where we're struggling. Our software currently is not giving us that flexibility or that it's not as easy as it might seem. So to contact. So it's automated right now, but for us to get a notice to say, hey, by the way, can you contact these folks after? Because sometimes it's a different crew. The crew that identified it and went to do the initial inspection might be 2 days after when it's cleaned up. So there's a little bit of a software issue there.
So with and I appreciate the policy and I appreciate the effort and I do really appreciate everything that bylaw is doing and how all of this is happening. So how can we then, what is needed in order to be able to, within the next 6 months, have some true ability to give feedback and to close the loop? So what type of software is needed and can that come back to council for approval? Because it seems to me that is probably the major complaint that I get. People call and stuff might get done, but no one seems to know and there's no closure. So if you require the software, what would it take?
So, thank you, Councilor Legere. So we did, or I did submit it for the budget for consideration for next year. So there is bylaw software that do exactly all that. So it's not just for encampments, for any complainant that we could do a proper follow-up. So it is part of the budget process.
Okay, I'm curious as to, though, why it is 3 or 4 years after going into this. Maybe Jeff, in terms of, I know you're new to this, but you know, we've done all of this stuff, and yet we don't have the software. So, without you answering necessarily, and it might be, how can we be assured that we get software? Because it seems like, wouldn't we be spinning our wheels if we don't really have the necessary tools to close the gaps?
Yeah, there's some budget requests in there to try to address, the whole follow-up, because the whole follow-up conversation is not just around encampments. It could be about any complaint that's gone through the bylaw process. And I know that's one of the areas we've identified that we have to do better on. So we've got in this year's budget proposal some items to try to address those.
Okay, all right. I think we need to make them a priority, so that's good. With respect to, if we had that software, would there be then the ability to have some expectations related to time frames? One of the complaints I get, or often comments, I don't think it would be a complaint, but what is the time frame between someone calling to say something is happening, whether it's someone sleeping in a park, whether it's someone doing drugs somewhere, and so on, and the actual response by law enforcement? And what is an expectation? Do we have one? And if we had one, then how do we measure that in order to improve?
Yeah, I mean, the chief may want to comment. I realize that we're getting calls from all over the city, and I mean, sometimes it's staffing. We can have people off sick. Lately, the last while, it's been trying to get all 19 positions filled. I believe we're very close to that, but certainly that's impacted service delivery probably over the last couple of months for sure, but we're getting up to fully staffed. Also, too, as well as a priority, because when we have the cleaning crew in here, we could have officers up Louisville Road and get a call over the other end of town and may not get there until later on, and maybe the person's left on their own, right? So, and that's probably frustrating for individuals as well. I know some of the debris cleanup calls, usually we bring in the cleanup crew 2 or 3 times a week, but if it's a Friday, it could be till Monday before that situation is cleaned up.
Is there a interim then solution to that, where, if we, I could cite an example on the weekend where it was in one of our small parks, and the debris, it was cited on Friday, and the debris was there, and the neighbors cleaned it up on the Sunday because of the fact that they didn't want to see it anymore. And so what do I tell them, and how can we, in the future, respond better?
Yeah, so Alexandre Binet and I have had some conversations about that. Is there an ability to use our operations crews in situations where things can't last until the following day or the next week? So we are having those conversations. It is a gap for sure. I mean, one of the successes of the DMCI program is that things are picked up relatively quickly. And there is gaps in the current system. I mean, the other thing is that current provider can be brought in for specific situations like that, but it is very expensive and costly. So and I mean, we're spending a lot of money on it now. So it's just about managing all those expectations as well as the financial side of it as well.
Okay. All right, I guess, and again, it would be nice as well to have at times, maybe even just a glimpse of the summary of activities that, how busy you are. I know we get some of that in the week at a glance, but really glean into how much impact bylaw is making. And my last question would be in and around the 48 to 72 hours, and that's a flexible amount of time. So why so wide, and why can't it be more defined with respect to, tolerating? Just your comments on why those up to 3 days is chosen.
So just on your first comment with regards to an update to council, as you will remember, the chief came in the public session in June and provided an update, and we're going to continue to do that quarterly. That's kind of the new thing moving forward. Well, he'll show those stats of the trailing, how much debris has been picked up, calls for service, and all that. So that should be helpful to council. The second part is sometimes it happens quicker. I mean, there's not with certain calls, they're told to 2 hours. So I mean, it is flexible and it's fluid. And I'm sorry to continue to repeat myself, but this is really what it calls for. Hard and fast rules don't really work. There has to be some discretion to those frontline officers that may or may not have reported those individuals. And if you can get voluntary compliance, and it takes longer, but you don't have to call the RCMP and you don't have to create a situation, that's far better than having to call and, you know, make a situation far worse than it needs to be. And for them, they're very good at what they do. I mean, really, really, they do a great job, and I have a tremendous amount of respect for them. And it's a balance because it's not easy.
No, and I would agree, and they do show a lot of compassion, and that's really important. I just wondered where the variation came from. So, thank you. Merci.
Merci, Conseiller Jacques. Conseiller Bourgeois.
Thank you very much, Councillor Bourgeois now. Thank you very much, Your Worship. And thank you, Mr. President, Mr. Landry. I have 3 questions.
I think I saw it somewhere in the policy. The policy really says that we will not tolerate camps on city land. Please correct me.
That's correct. Public land, city-owned land, you're right.
Okay. It doesn't come across that way. It comes across as a way to, how do I say this, attack the camps that do establish on city lands, right? So the head statement should read, no camps allowed. And then, well, whenever there is somebody who does speeding, well, then there is a process of stopping that person and arresting them and taking them to court and giving them a fine and whatever, etc. I'm just doing it parallel. I'm not saying we should fine the people, but this doesn't come across, and I think that should have more of a priority presence in the policy. We have to state very clearly, for me, I get it, it's a policy that guides administrative procedures. I really don't care as much about how you guys and girls do your job as I want the citizens to know that we are tackling this issue by refusing camps. And here's a policy that says we refuse camps. If a camp is set on policy on city land, then this is how we are going to deal with it. But the intent of the policy is to disallow, get rid of camps. And that does not come across as what the objective is. The results for the citizens and city council, this is what I'm looking for. I'm not looking at the process, I'm looking at the product, and the product would be a reduction over time of camps, a reduction also over time of the homeless people that do require alternatives such as camps. But you know what I mean? The big ticket message of this policy to me is put on the back burner rather than the front burner.
Thank you, Councillor. So criteria for action on page 3, the first statement says encampments in public spaces owned by the city of Moncton will not be permitted. That line could be moved to the purpose statement. Nick, don't know what your position on that, but that may address those concerns. If that's the will of council, certainly can modify that and put it in the preamble statement.
That's probably best. Yes, it's got to hit. It's got to be clear to our citizens and to everybody involved in this that that's the ultimate goal. Now, that said, there will be camps, just like there will be speeding, even if there's signs that says don't go over 50 kilometers an hour. Okay, so if you can consider that by the time it gets to public, I would appreciate that. I think that has to be the message from a council policy. If it was an administrative policy, that's fine. You guys and girls figure out the best way to do that job. But from a public policy to the citizens, the big ticket item must be front burner, no camps allowed. Thank you. The other question then, policy targets, results that we hope for, that we can measure so that this policy does make a difference. And the only criteria I just mentioned that, the two of them, one is that there would be a reduction in camps over time. Otherwise, we have a policy that doesn't really prevent camps and just basically solves them whenever there's got to be a better proactive strategy. So what would be the results that we are trying to see, that we can measure and that we can determine in 2-3 years that this policy works? I didn't find that in the policy.
Yeah, no, I think definitely one metric is, the reduction of encampments. Although, again, as you mentioned, there's a lot of those variables that we don't control, right? The influx of individuals that aren't housed into Moncton. I think for me personally, is driving by Victoria Park and places like that and not seeing encampments. I think for us, that is one of the biggest benchmarks that we see, is that we've been fairly successful in maintaining the public spaces to the current state. Obviously, sometimes people sneak into places where we, don't always see, but for the most part, when I drive around the city and I see citizens enjoying these public spaces, and we've had tremendous uptake over the last couple of years of our public spaces, and to me, that's success.
Whatever it is, I think it behooves us to say not only here's a process that we're going to use, but there's also preventative measures. I'm not sure that can be, but I would hope for, but also that we can measure the success of this policy. Let's say you show up to council in July of next year, and you'll say, in the previous year, we had 22 camps. We dismantled 19 of them. By the time we got to the last 3, people as we went along, that campings would not be tolerated, so camps would not be tolerated, so we had a reduction in camps, something to that effect. So if you can think it through, it's not my expertise, but what could we measure this policy success by?
So one of the metrics, Councillor, that the chief can report on in his updates is exactly that: complaints, as well as encampments dismantled, cleanups done. He'll provide that information on an ongoing basis quarterly.
Perfect. My final question is, so I would suggest you have that somewhere in the policy, maybe as an appendix, I don't know. My third one, there is a sentence there, and please forgive me, Mr. Preston, because I don't have my copy of the policy. I can either read the policy or I can't access my eScribe right now, so I cannot see the notes that I had written. But I had a question as to, you had one of the conditions or one of the grounds that you could step in would be fire hazard or something to that effect. I don't need the exact quote, but if I'm wrong, just correct me. But there was something like, 10 conditions,
yes,
or 10 situations. One of them was fire risk. I would argue with you that one alone, there is always a risk. Maybe not in the winter, but definitely in the summer. In any camp, Councillor Edgett alluded to it earlier. They have to cook their food, or they have to, maybe some nights they have to keep warm or something, and they will light a fire. So it's sort of the most dangerous consequence. Secondly would be they have to steal from somebody's backyard to feed their drugs, or to build their fires with propane tanks or whatever it is. But the question to me is, how do we prevent the risk of fire? And if we can, any and all interventions are justified, right? Because there will be a fire risk.
Yeah, so any encampment that we become aware of, either through a complaint process of our own or of our own being out there and become aware, will be dismantled at some point. It may change priority based on those conditions that are there. But yes, it will be dismantled at some point.
Yes, but the fire risk will always be there. So is there any way we can prevent fires from being lit on camp?
Not that I'm aware of.
Have we lost Conseil Bourgeois? Conseil Bourgeois? I think we have. Il est là? Non. OK. Est-ce que je continue avec les questions?
Should I continue with questions?
Wait. So before we go to Conseiller Crossman, is there anyone who hasn't spoken who wishes to ask a question or speak? If not, I will go to Conseiller Crossman.
Thank you, Your Worship. It's a new question, so it's new information, Jeff. How many encampments do we currently have that we are tracking, the city of Moncton? I'm really cautious about these ones with the YMCA that they're not telling us about. And I know they're telling you about them, but they're only in the late stages. So how many?
I'm just going off the top of my head. I believe at the last meeting, there was 24 or 25 that we were aware of, and we were addressing. We had to address 22 or 20 of the 23 or 24. That's kind of been the weekly number, somewhere between 23 and 26, 27. And usually by the end of week and the start of the next cycle, those are cleaned up and addressed.
So that's what you mean by addressing those 20?
Yep.
Let's say 23.
Yep.
Are made aware to you on Tuesday, they're cleaned up. And
Yeah, that's ongoing. It's
that's
just-
ongoing. It's just
Yeah.
vicious cycle. It's continuous.
Yes.
How many people per site? How many people overall are experiencing these encampments?
Yeah, and it's a difficult number. I don't know. There's definitely got to be a couple of individuals out there somewhere. I mean, there's times where we don't really know where people are. I mean, we know there's different numbers that are utilized by HDC and different agencies, 500, 600, but we don't know really how many people are out there.
Okay, and HTC is the Human Development Council, which
Yes.
I'm looking at right now, which
Yes.
says 720 are experiencing more than 1 day of homelessness.
That's right.
But they're not all in camp.
No, they're not. I mean, we have 260 some individuals or 240 housed in shelter right now.
Right. And what I'm concerned about is the newly identified that are coming into the system. To your point, it was 52 in the month of May.
Yes.
We haven't seen June or July numbers yet, so it'd be interesting to see what June was at.
It's typically a net increase. That's how it's been trending monthly.
Right, 74 inflow and houses only 37. So I mean, there's more coming in than actually being housed. So to your point that you made earlier, and that's why I stress the provinces should be involved in this so much, especially social development, is they have rent subs and they have housing accessibility to a certain level. That's not our responsibility as a city to provide that housing. That's the province. So that's why I'm going to keep mentioning that, Jeff. Even when you come back at the public session, I'll ask those same questions again. So I just want to be clear on that. That's all. Thank you, Your Worship.
Merci. Have we lost Conseiller Bourgeois? We have. Okay, so we do have a motion that's been moved and seconded. Merci beaucoup, Jeff. Merci. So we'll go to an electronic vote. Is that correct? Okay, merci.
Can we see the results, please?
So it's motion carried.
Yes,
Merci.
with Councillor Bourgeois not present.
C'est bon, merci. Madame la greffière.
Next would be
Thank you, Madam Clerk, now.
Angelique Reddy is here, Inclusion and Employee Engagement Advisor, to provide us an overview.
Good afternoon. Bonjour, Madame Maras, members of council, Mr. City Manager. So I've been asked to review the drafted policy on religious symbols This policy is meant to guide how religious groups are to request the display of their religious symbols. The goal of the process was to be inclusive, respectful of religious diversity, and align with promising practices from across Canada. And as you know, the city does not currently have a formal policy on how it administers the request of religious symbols on municipal policy or property. So this policy is meant to help guide the process. And I'd just like to comment that it was myself and Aloma Jardine, the Director of Communications, that had helped engage with many of these different groups. So the intent of the policy is to provide a clear framework that will reflect the city's religious diversity and, of course, to promote inclusion in the city. And the goal is to not to modify any current displays, but to provide a process and guidelines to permit the addition of new displays on municipal property. It's also important to note that the city has displayed Christian and Jewish religious symbols on municipal property for many years. And these religious faiths will still have their symbols and would actually only fall under this policy should they wish to change their religious symbols. And so as a reminder, the motion that was made in December 2004 that council had made when the city had made the decision to not display religious symbols at City Hall in late 2023, Moncton City Council had passed the following two motions that you can see there, essentially to redisplay the religious symbols and then to ask the Social Inclusion Committee to engage with religious organization on the best way to display religious symbols. So I'll just review just quickly some of the key milestones in this process. So as you know, the Chris McPherson report had come to City Council in August 2024, and essentially it was an independent internal review that was requested following the events that led to the decision to not display religious symbols. And the purpose was to identify lessons learned and a path forward towards greater community understanding, inclusivity, and harmony. And there was 10 recommendations that were made as a part of that report to council. And this process has helped implement several of those recommendations. Following that process, a third-party jurisdictional scan was done, and essentially the city had contracted an independent consultant that is a specialist in public engagement, and they had reviewed 10 municipalities from across Canada to essentially provide some promising practices and some examples of what cities are doing in terms of a jurisdictional scan, and it was really a comprehensive overview on how those cities manage the display of religious symbols on municipal property. Following that process, an internal engagement process was done, and essentially that was done with parks, events, legal, and communications, and really to take a look at what are some potential areas at the city where we could display religious symbols. In terms of things like snow clearing, safety, wind, all those things to take into consideration. And based on that internal engagement and the third-party jurisdictional scan, some drafted high-level guidelines were created. Those drafted guidelines and an engagement plan were presented to the Social Inclusion Committee in October of 2024 for their feedback and review. And then in November, engagement was done with religious organizations or religious leaders. Those religious leaders or religious organizations were selected based on 180 followers or more based on the 2021 census. And following that, information was collected, feedback was incorporated, and then it was brought, an updated guideline was brought to leadership in January with the final updates. Again, after that, a few small little revisions to leadership, and then again to the Social Inclusion Committee just a couple months ago for their final review, and then that brings us here today. So in terms of the discussion with religious organization, it was a very insightful, positive discussion. We met with the religious leaders, and the scope of the engagement was to better understand the needs, considerations, and potential suitable locations that would appeal to the religious community in Moncton for the display of religious symbols. And the goal was essentially not to take anything away, but to create a policy and process for new religious groups to request their symbols to be displayed. When we went into that dialogue, there was two non-negotiables that we went into it with, which was basically we're committed to displaying religious symbols on municipal property, and the focus is on religious symbols and not necessarily cultural symbols. So the religious organizations or leaders that were consulted, you can see here. So we had met as a group with the Christian community, and you could see the leaders that we had consulted with: Jewish, Sikh, Muslim, and Hindu. And so prior to meeting in person with all these leaders, we did do telephone calls with them, asking them to identify who they wish to attend the meeting. And following all of the meetings, we had shared back the notes with the religious leaders to make sure that we had captured the right information based on their feedback. There was two locations that were identified, and this is mainly in consultation with the internal, in terms of the internal consultation, especially with our Parks Department. There's a lot of safety considerations that come into play when presenting or displaying a symbol or anything for that matter in terms of wind and things like that. So there's two suitable locations. It was Parc Gérald Leblanc, so right beside City Hall, and then the second was Boer Park. Boer Park, the small yellow arrow just indicates essentially where there's an electrical source. So the common themes that we did here was that the preferred space was Gérald Leblanc Park, and that visibility was very important to these religious organizations. They had no issues when we had proposed the high-level guidelines in terms of requiring CRA registration or religious groups purchasing and storing their own religious symbol. Or having the final design approved by the city. And again, that's mainly due to safety. And the CR registration, you'll see shortly, we had modified that just a little bit. In terms of the request to recognize, additional feedback we did hear, though, was the request to recognize Christianity as 3 distinct groups. You can see Catholic, Protestant, and Orthodox. Would allow each to display 1 symbol per year. Would recognize 2 largest religious communities in Moncton, Catholic and Protestant. 1 symbol, and then one of the other feedback we had heard, does this also include like Santa Claus, angels, stars, things like that? And then the other feedback we did hear too was to change the maximum display time from 30 days to 45 days. We heard this from the Muslim community as well as the Christian community. Additional feedback also was to have 1 religious symbol at both locations. And another feedback that we did hear was the request for the city to install a permanent structure to display signage celebrating religious festivals, like a digital display. So based on some of the feedback we had heard, the promising practices from across Canada, and really trying to come up as council had asked for a Moncton-specific solution, the recommended guidelines that we're bringing forth today to council are here. So religious symbols may be temporarily displayed at a designated location on municipal property. Again, in recognition of the diversity of religious faiths in Moncton, and again, to promote inclusiveness. That religious organizations or leaders are to request the display and must be traditionally and widely recognized by the community. We're recommending 1 symbol per year per religious organization, and the displays must be respectful of other faiths, installed for no more than 45 days, and installed at location designated by the City Council policy, and meet all other display and event criteria in the City of Moncton's event policy as well. Again, that the city would approve the design, ensuring it meets the guidelines for size and safety. More than one symbol may be displayed at a time. So in the previous map that GIS had done, you saw that there was space for 4 religious symbols at the same time, but it would be in one of those approved spaces. Applicants will be offered alternate dates or locations if the number of requests exceed available space. When we had looked at the jurisdictional scan, there's not necessarily more than 2 that would overlap, but at least that would provide additional as should Moncton's religious community continue to grow. Applications will be made through an online form on the City of Moncton's website, so a similar process to the memorial benches or the lighting process at the city. Also, applicants are responsible for all associated costs and labor, including the purchase of new displays, the setup and takedown, storage, insurance for theft, damage, and injury. And city administration will administer the policy to seek clarification from council as necessary. Also, rejected applicants will be provided with reasons for the rejection, and they'll also have an opportunity to appeal should they be refused, and this would be through our CAO. So those are the recommended guidelines. Open it up.
Merci beaucoup, Angélique. We do have a motion, so Councillor Steves, you wish to move, and seconded by Councillor Butler. Questions, Councillor Steves?
Yeah, I do have a question. Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Thank you, Angelique, again for all your work on this and consulting with all the different faith leaders and whatnot. I spoke to several of them. They're really pleased that they were able to give some feedback on that. My question just is regarding the manger. A couple years ago when we were discussing it, I think I was told by Alexandre maybe that it was on its last life. And maybe I'm getting that confused with what was at Centennial Park, the white lit up symbols. I'm just wondering if anybody's checked in on that condition and if this is the right time to purchase that, and just to, if it is on its last life, but now we've got new life, it's able to be displayed again more long-term, who makes that decision? And the second part to that is, has there been any thought about a plexiglass piece on that trailer to prevent people from going in? I know we laugh a little bit at it. The baby Jesus has been stole several times. But a piece of plexiglass, I would think, to enclose that might be wise now that we're moving ahead. Perhaps you've had conversations about those things.
Yes, actually, in terms of the trailer, so I believe Dan Hickson Parks would probably be best to answer that. However, the trailer itself, from my understanding, the hinges on the trailer that holds up the manger that's essentially what's on its last life, okay. But the actual manger itself, I think it's still in good condition, as well as all the structures that are in there as well. And so I think it's more of the trailer. I think it can be lowered like that. The manger itself could be lowered onto the ground and still fall within this policy. However, the Christian community can certainly decide should they wish to update it. If they were to update it, that's when they would fall under this new policy. But just by lowering it onto the ground and taking away the trailer, when it does become actually unsafe, they would still fall under this because they're not changing it. The plexiglass, I did ask about that too, and I think that is something we'll be looking at this year as well to make sure that there's no more thefts and things like that.
Great. Well, I really think the Protestant and Catholic Jewish communities will be happy with this new policy, and so we're thankful for that.
Merci. Any other questions? If not, we will go to the vote. So it's electronic.
Let me see the results.
Motion carried. Merci beaucoup, Angélique.
Okay, merci. Yes, the next would be 5.4, Budget Update 2026 Reform, and Mr. Doucette, our CFO, is here to give us an update.
Bonjour, Jacques.
Bonjour. Just waiting for the presentation to come up. All right, thank you. So today we're going to give you a budget update. It's a little bit early in the process, but there are two happenings, two things that have occurred under kind of the provincial decision-making process that will impact our budget. And for us in administration, we begin our budget process normally in June. We get some preliminary information and then we go into it. So today, the two things we're going to be looking at is, one is the provincial assessment freeze. So that is one thing which will occur for the 2026 budget year. The second thing is to review the potential impacts of the fiscal reform's new funding model. So these are two different things. There are two different things happening at the province. The fiscal reform, this began under the former provincial government. It had to do with the provincial local government reform, and it was a fiscal framework to ensure that municipalities have the proper funding to operate. The provincial assessment freeze, the first item, this just occurred probably a month and a half to 2 months ago. And so there are two different processes. They will both impact our budget, but we don't know yet to what magnitude. So the purpose for this today is to discuss these two things. How will it impact city budgets? We're presenting options to council today. There are more options than that. We're just presenting three that we feel as administration is reasonable. And today it's really to get some preliminary feedback. We'll be back to council in August or September before we finalize the draft budget. But for today, it's really to seek preliminary feedback or so on, because it will help us in establishing next year's budget. So the first thing we're going to discuss is the provincial assessment freeze. So what that means is, for taxation purposes, all assessment of all properties are frozen for the 2026 budget year. So for tax purposes, if you were paying on the value of your house was $300,000 last year, it will be the same next year. The same applies for also commercial properties as well. The only exceptions are new constructions, major improvements, sales and transfers of properties. I'll focus a little bit here on major improvements because that's a question that I often receive from my desk. So if you make an addition to your property, it's only the portion of the addition that will be assessed, that will increase. So that doesn't mean that if, for example, you build a garage, that your entire property will go at it's just the value of the addition or the renovation that will get assessed at the actual value. So the impact of the freeze, what that means is basically, except for sales and renovations or so on, our assessment is frozen from the 2025 budget to the 2026 budget. What it also does, that doesn't necessarily mean, though, that the city does not get more revenues, because again, how a property tax bill is calculated, there is the assessment in one hand, and then there's the municipal rate on the other hand. So it doesn't prevent councils to increase the tax rates, to still get some revenues. But what it's done here, it's put all the political pressures on the local government councils, that if the residents, the commercial owners or so on, see an increase in their property tax bill, the province can ultimately say, well, we froze assessments. Those were decisions made by local governments. Versus in the past, it used to be a combined kind of decision-making process that would lead to your ultimate bills. The last time this happened, it forced 41 municipalities to increase their tax rate. And from speaking to my colleagues across the province, there will be some who will have no choice but to increase the tax rates. That's just the fiscal situation that they're in. And the other impact of the freeze is it prevents local governments from reducing the tax rates, which is really beneficial when people are building new projects or so on. So Moncton City Council has reduced the tax rate by 21 cents over the past 4 budget cycles. If you're building an apartment building or something like that, the property taxes, it's your second biggest expense line after the mortgage. So that can make a difference on future new projects. So today we mapped out 3 options, kind of explain a little bit. The number 1 option that we've matched is to maintain the tax rate just as it is for the 2025 budget. The other one is to increase the tax rate by 2.5% to 1.3954. Reason we chose this is that 2.5% aligns, is very close to what CPI is running right now. And the third one is increase the tax rate by 4.5% to 1.4227. That 4.5% is similar to what council approved in the 2025 budget last year. So that's why we chose those 3 options. Again, there could be options that are more than 4.5%. Again, reduction of tax rate is still a possibility. So there's many different options we could look at, but these are 3 that we feel will provide a good guideline on where council feels we should end up at. This is just a summary to provide some information to council that if we were to maintain the tax rate, we have to remember that a lot of our expense line items, our collective bargaining agreements, our NB power rates, our contracts or so on that are locked in with inflationary increases in them. If we maintain the tax rate as a city and nothing else changes, right now we're probably looking at a deficit of 1.5 million to 2.5 million. We can overcome that because we have a $230 million budget now, so it's not the end of the world, but it's just a good picture to show. If we increase by 2.5%, that could mean that, again, the resident would see an increase to their property taxes around $120 from the 2025 budget year. It would provide the city a surplus from 2.4 to 3.4 million, and the same would go for the 4.5%. And again, the table we're showing here now does not include any information from the fiscal reform, and I'll get into that a little bit later on. So what does this look like? Why did the province decide to freeze assessment for 2026? And this slide would kind of summarize it. So a property, and we're using a property assessment of $350,000. The one thing that's important, and I'm not sure if you've read it, in Moncton now, there was an article, I believe it was in CBC or another of the media, on the $350,000 property right now. People could be paying 15, 20, 25 different property tax bill right now because of the spike protection mechanism. It all depended at what time you bought your house and where you're at, because we're not paying, residential properties are not paying their property tax bill on the real assessment of their property. There's a spike protection mechanism that kind of protects them. But this is just an example of why the province kind of decided, okay, this year, for affordability purposes, they decided to freeze the assessment. So it just goes to show the impact if we maintain the tax rate, if we increase by 2.5, and we increase by 4.5, but we're seeing the impact of the 5-year change as well. And this is where we receive some phone calls, some emails that some people are tapped out if you're on fixed income or things like that. So option 1, this is the one we're going to spend a little bit more time because it will have a bigger impact on the city if council decides to move forward with this. So the first one is we keep the tax rate exactly the same. So could the city manage that? Yes, we could. It would certainly have some impacts that on projects that we have that we're planning to do or so on, but we could manage it. One way we could manage it is we pay for a portion of our capital budget, we pay it through our capital from operating. So rather than bond, we pay it directly from the budget. When COVID occurred, this is how we balanced our budget. We lost $4.5 million in revenues. We delayed a few capital projects by a year. We reduced the amount we pay directly, and we could balance it that way. Other opportunities as well, we could delay investments in level 2s and level 3 so we could stay at the status quo. It's an option. We, of course, would have to freeze some discretionary spend. So discretionary spends are items that we can do it. You know, a collective bargaining agreement, there's a contract, we have no choice but to pay. A discretionary, for example, a travel account or so on, we could freeze those and not necessarily increase it with inflation. One tactic that we've used in the past, we delay some hiring. So it's not necessarily that you do not hire positions or so on, but rather than keep them vacant for 2 or 3 months during the normal cycle, you wait 4, 5, 6 months. It just provides more relief. We could do some expense management through lean projects. They will take time. They do have impacts. And of course, we can always increase user fees. We talk about Kodiak Transpo, all the other recreational activities, some parking tickets or things like that. We could always look at that. But really, it's your capital from operating that is your biggest driver to be able to balance a budget for the city of Moncton. Now, that's the provincial assessment freeze, assuming that nothing else happens or so on. If we maintain the tax rate, there could be some consequences, reduction in capital projects, expense management, or so on. Now, today, we're also going to talk about the fiscal reform. So the fiscal reform, this occurred a long time ago, and there's 3 components. So the province has acknowledged that local governments did not have enough funding to be able to operate. It applies to different local governments in a different way. For us in Moncton, some would consider our fiscal position to be really fortunate. We see growth, we have new developments or so on, but there are other areas of the province where they do not see the same benefits. So they've acknowledged, and for the 2026 budget year, they've acknowledged that they will increase the fundings to local governments in 3 different buckets. The first one is the Fiscal Capacity Fund. So that used to be the community funding grant. So for us, the city of Moncton, that's the equalization that we used to call. We receive very little funding from that. We're in a group with Fredericton and St. John, and St. John receives most of the funding from that area. So we'll see when this is announced. We don't necessarily know what Moncton will get. The Regional Service Support Fund, so the city of Moncton will not receive anything from that. That goes to the Regional Service Commissions, but it could also benefit the city indirectly if they assume some responsibilities that we're now paying for. And we have the Capital Renewal Fund. So this is a major item for the province and for local governments. It's something that local governments had been advocating for. We do not have enough funding to look after our existing assets. You think about our sidewalks, our roads, our buildings, or so on. Each local government is having a real hard time in maintaining their assets with the funding that they currently receive. So as I mentioned, for the first one, the Fiscal Capacity Fund, I don't believe that the city of Moncton will receive a lot of funding there. The Regional Support Services Fund, again, could potentially help, but we don't think it will make that much of an impact. The Capital Renewal Fund, which is $45 million for the 2026 budget year, I think the amount is unknown yet of what we'll receive. We will receive funding there as the biggest city in New Brunswick. If they could use different things, whether it be population, your net book value of your assets or so on, to distribute those funds. So we should receive funding there. The one thing there, if we receive funding from the $45 million stream and we have to reduce our capital budget to maintain the tax rate, if we receive funding here, it could actually offset the reductions that we would do from the provincial freeze. Now, that being said, though, it's still less money going to our existing assets, which is a need by all local governments in this province. The next portion of my presentation is just to kind of highlight, I'll go over it quickly, but budget pressures that we're facing here at the city. So again, there's a lot of unfunded priorities in our 5-year capital budget, master plans or so on. They're not funded. Costs remain high. Construction cost is extremely high. That has remained. Nothing has gone down. Inflation has kind of stabilized, but we're still paying at the high rates. Higher interest rates do impact because when you bond, if you have to pay more in fiscal payments, it does have an impact. Maintaining existing assets and maintaining current operations. We had some presentations today around, bylaw and things like that. There are pressures on our city just to maintain current operations. And growth and priorities. We have always been successful because we strategically invest in growth, and that's not something we can stop, right? If there's new developments or so on, we have to support those developments with roads, infrastructure, or so on. Other things, again, we talk about Kodiak Transpo. We have our infrastructure service growth, so we know the Vision Lands is coming up soon. Here we have fleet electrification, but really it's the entire environmental issues, GHG reductions that we have as a target. We have our public safety. We hear from council around fire, social issues, police, active transportation, the environmental climate reporting. Then we have our master plans. Again, these master plans are not fully funded. So the Riverfront Master Plan, the Recreation Master Plan. We talked about satellite locations, new aquatic facilities, operation center and warm storage. So the warm storage is at the end of its useful life. It will need to be enhanced, and there are other things as well. We talked about future markets, convention centers, city hall upgrades, or so on. And there are many more as well. Those are just the ones that we're mentioning. So to summarize this, again, and it's just a preliminary update, but Council has the option to increase the tax rate to offset provincial assessment freeze. Council did reduce the tax rate when we were seeing major assessment increases, so it's still an option. So the provincial assessment freeze, it's only one component. Council ultimately still has the decision. We can maintain the current tax rate, but it's going to impact our ability for 1 year to fund priorities. It is what it is if council determines to do so, unless the fiscal reform funding that we receive will offset the provincial assessment freeze, right? And again, as always, for city budgets, we have to be in a balanced position. Prioritization is going to be really crucial for the upcoming budget, including the 5-year capital plan. So our plan right now, when this presentation was supposed to go 2 weeks ago, was to return in August for council for final budget direction. It may have to be September based on some information that I've received from the province. We may only know the result of the fiscal reform in early September. So that may be one thing that it may be a month late, but it doesn't really matter one way or another. We'll come back to council for final direction. And today the purpose, again, is to receive feedbacks, to answer questions or so on. I know Councillor Crossman had some questions, so I'll let him ask and I will respond before going there. And it's really to hear from council today as we embark on our budget process for the summer. So that's all for today. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup, Jacques. Excellent travail, hein? Merci. Donc, on a des questions. Il n'y a pas de motion sur ceci. Donc, est-ce qu'il y a des questions? Conseiller Crossman.
Thank you, Your Worship. Jacques, thanks for the presentation. I know a lot of work has gone into it. I've seen it through, agenda reviews. You're always bringing it up. And what happened with the province with regards to the assessment freeze, you brought it up automatically to agenda review, and you were concerned about it then. So I do have a couple questions. I did send them to you, and I've made a few more questions as you went through your presentation because you jogged my memory. a couple years ago, council put this out, or city staff put this out, and you know what this is.
Yes.
This is a breakdown of somebody who pays on a $300,000 assessment house. They would pay $4,300, let's say, in property tax. So my question to you is, as I look at this, all that property tax comes back to the city of Moncton, that $4,300. And it pays for fire, police, road, solid waste pickup, public transit, everything that you mentioned here. General government, parks, facilities, operations, grants, culture, some of the stuff you didn't touch on as well. But all that money comes back to the city of Moncton. So with the property assessment that's going to go on and the freeze that's going to happen from the province of New Brunswick, where do we go from here on all those beautiful things? Because that money comes into the city of Moncton to be spent on the citizens who's paid the taxes, but the province has frozen the money, or frozen the assessment. So can you explain to me the difference between freezing of the assessment and what the city of Moncton does with the tax money that we collect?
Yes, thank you, Your Worship, to Councillor Crossman. So I'll kind of elaborate a little bit on just how it works. And let's focus on the residential property owner right now.
And then industrial, I'll ask you later.
That's right. So
Yeah.
the residential property owner has an assessment value tied to their property. So that is the value of their property, what it's worth. So a house could be worth 300, 354, and so on. That's the assessment portion. That's one piece of how a property tax bill is calculated. The second piece is the municipal tax rate that is applied to that assessment.
Okay, so just before you go away from that assessment, I got a knock on the door. A gentleman from the Residential Assessor Property Assessment Services. That assessment is done by the province of New Brunswick. Has nothing to do with the city of Moncton. That is an independent employee from the province, correct?
That's right. In New Brunswick, the province is responsible for doing the assessment of all New Brunswick property.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to clarify that before you move on.
So that is the portion that they've frozen. So they've decided that whatever assessment value, property assessment value that you had last year, that is the same value that will be assessed for tax purposes next year. That's what they froze. Now, local governments, councils, will apply a tax rate to that when preparing the final budget. It's your assessment for tax purposes multiplied by your rate that equals your property tax bill. So by freezing assessment, it doesn't necessarily dictate what the final property tax bill will be, because the other portion is the municipal tax rate is applied to it, which will, at the end, those two values multiplied by each other will equal the property tax bill. So for a residential property owner occupied, all that the provincial freeze means is that we can't necessarily tell you your property tax bill will not increase next year, but it won't be because of the assessment. That's basically where we stand today. It's not necessarily negative, because it had to do with trying to protect that some had affordability issues, but that's how it is. Now, for a residential property owner that owns its principal residence, all property taxes come back to the city. And that property tax that comes back to the city goes to pay for the services you mentioned, policing, fire, recreational buildings, or so on. For commercial properties, it's a little different. The municipal tax rate applies. The province also applies a tax rate that goes to them. So there, for a commercial owner or an owner of a residential property, which is their second residence, they're going to almost pay, this is where you hear the term double tax, right? You pay the municipal portion and the provincial portion. So that's kind of the way it works.
Okay. And another question that I had sent you earlier was in regards to how much of a decrease city council has approved with regards to that municipal tax rate. And you just said in your presentation today that it was 21%, or sort of 21 cents.
That's right.
Roughly over the last 4 years.
That's right.
How much has assessment gone up in the last 4 years?
Oh, it's gone up So if we look at it in percentages, and that's why I had it on one of the slides here. So the city of Moncton was able to reduce the tax rate, but property owners are still seeing still an increase because assessments for most properties are going up for taxation purposes 10% per year. And that's for the foreseeable future as well, because during COVID, we had a lot of the property values rose drastically, 25, 30, 40, 50% or so on. And we've only been able to capitalize on 10% per year. So we're still seeing, when we map it out, a lot of properties will never reach their max until 7, 8, 9 years or so on. And that's assuming the market would stay flat, right? If it just keeps going up. But City Council, though, has still, in Moncton, and we're kind of the leaders across the province. Once we kind of go one way, the other ones kind of follow. Most local governments who could have reduced their tax rate to try and offset those major assessment increases.
Right, and again, just for clarity, those major assessment increases are coming from the province of New Brunswick, not the city of Moncton. And we have offset those increases by lowering our municipal tax rate
That's right.
because of the affordability of the residents who are actually living in those residents, being able to afford the tax rate so that we can turn around and give them services that they're paying for.
That's right.
So I'm trying to figure out how freezing the tax rate is going to keep people more affordable. Because we as the council are going to have this discussion, to your point, where we keep it the current rate, which could mean holding back on projects that are desperately needed throughout the city, such as policing and fire and all these other things. You're talking about holding back on level 2s and 3s when we just had a presentation a couple of minutes ago on a bylaw software update that could be a level 2 or 3 that could be gone. And we're not getting ahead of the real crisis that Moncton is under, which is trying to figure out this homelessness and all the associated parts that come with it and the costs associated with it. But yet here we are trying to tell people we'll make it affordable. But we as council may have to increase your rate. And that may put more pressure on people to, busing, Kodiak Transport you talked about, who has seen a great increase in ridership, but the rates may go up. User pay system at the arenas around the city could go up. Water pay system could go up. All these things can go up based on a decision made by the province of New Brunswick without resorting to us first to see our input on making those comments that we're going to freeze assessments. This came to you as out of the blue, right? I mean, when the words were said, but I don't think they were talked to with city staff, with city management, were they?
From a provincial assessment freeze, not that I'm aware of.
Not that you're aware of. Mr. CAO, were you at any point aware of this before it was made public?
No, we were not.
Okay, good. Thank you. I appreciate that. One last question, Jacques, that you jogged my memory on, and I'm going to say it's my last question, but I'm not sure. Yeah, I'll say it is. You talked about the fiscal end of all this, and I've got it in front of me right now. The community grant. How much did we get last year, the city of Moncton, in the community grant?
I believe it's 1.2 million.
And about, let's say, when I got on council in 2012?
I think it was around 12, 13 million back then.
Okay, so you're thinking that probably moving forward, you're going to see 1 million, maybe less than 1 million come back to us? Because if I look at this, it's not a lot of money, Jacques, to go around all these communities. It really isn't. When you think about $45 million, into infrastructure amongst 41 communities, that's not a lot of money.
No, so I'll just provide a little bit more information on that one. So the equalization one, that would be your fiscal capacity fund. That's 75 million.
Right.
It used to be 63 million. Now with fiscal reform, and I failed to mention this, and I apologize, the funding will continue to increase for the next 5 years. So it's implemented, it's going to gradually increase over the next 5 years. The plan of additional funding was around $130 million that would go to local governments from the provincial. So in terms of the fiscal capacity fund, before this fiscal reform and whatever's announced, which I do not know what the final details will be yet, we were in 2 years not going to receive anything anymore because they've diverted the core grant of that and they're providing it to the regional service commissions. For the capital renewal fund, 45 million, and that amount will continue to grow though, which is a good thing. That will be your major category that will continue to grow as the years advanced. It's not big dollars in terms of if you look at all local governments, but there's a lot of local governments in this province that don't have a lot of infrastructure. They don't have they just have roads basically, which the province owns, and maybe a municipal building or so on. So that's where the bigger cities should receive good funding. It may not offset the impact of freezing assessments, assuming council decides to freeze the tax rate, but that funding, if nothing else had changed, would have made a big difference over 5 years when it gets to that, to the full amount. Right now it's 45 and I forget what it's supposed to go, but if let's say it goes to 70 million or something, that could help because it's something distributed to everyone and it goes to existing assets. So it takes a big pressure off of our capital budget process.
Right, and our current assets are, I think we're well behind, right? And as far as engineering goes, I
Oh,
believe.
absolutely. And I think that's the same across the province. We're probably one of the local governments that's in the better shape, but we still have a significant infrastructure deficit of, I believe across the province, it was over $1 billion, so.
Wow, okay. And if Her Worship would provide just one more question. I had it in my email earlier that 8 cents on every dollar, Jacques, we always talk about this, a budget. We've seen to put it aside the last few budgets. How much of that is true now? How does that break down? Because if they're gonna freeze the assessment, they're still collecting additional money because we have a population growth. All this tax money is still being collected. So can you explain that?
Yeah, so the 8 cents, so this runs from 8 to 10 cents. That's what it is. That is a study that it's a rate that is calculated by FCM, so the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. And what that accounts, it's the average of all tax dollars paid by Canadians. Municipalities only get about 8 cents. So in there's property taxes, there's HST, there's income tax, there's debt tax, there's all different taxes that we pay. Municipal governments only receive 8% of those across the country. Yet the responsibilities of local governments continue to increase, whether it be social issues, whether it be housing, whether it be... So that's kind of the point that FCM is trying to make with that is we have to look after everything you mentioned, police, fire, services, buildings, or so on, but we only get 8 cents. So anytime there's additional pressures applied to or downloading of services, whether it be from the federal government or the provincial government, we only have 8 cents to be able to manage those priorities.
Right, good. Thank you. Thank you, Your Worship. I appreciate it.
Merci, Conseiller Crossman. Conseiller Butler.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Thanks, Jacques, for as always, the great explanation of what's happening with us. Just the tail end of Councillor Crosman's or Deputy Mayor Crosman's, the growth in the city is, when you drive any place, there's, you see the cranes in the air, it's growing. I mean, you just go along Millennium Boulevard and it's just unbelievable that's going on there in the North End and downtown. So, with the growth, I mean, with the more, even if they freeze the assessment, there's still, the growth is still there as far as tax dollars coming in to us. So, I just, we've gone through this before, and the reason why we've always, dropped the tax rate was because of, our population was getting older and so much fixed income. And, if we got to tighten our belts, I've always been that type of person. If you got to tighten your belts, you tighten your belts. And I'm glad that you started off that we would be able to survive for 1 year without increasing tax rate, because that would be the way I'd be looking at this. You know, we're probably, and we are, according to all reports, the fastest growing city in Canada, actually. So, I mean, with that, I would find it hard to say to a senior that, you know, and when you look at, you know, I was talking to a lady the other day, and she was saying about just the investments, her investments, and like, you know, with what's going on in the United States and things like that. You know, she's on a fixed income, like she gets Canada pension, old age pension, and a very little pension from where she worked. And, you know, just thinking of our conversation, seeing this, even went up by, if that went up by $119, $120, that would, you know, there may be some in this room that wouldn't be too much to think of, you know, for myself. But you know, for these people, that is something that we as counselors, we have to sit here and we have to really think about that. So, you know, if there's any way possible that we can do it with keeping it the same, and because, you know, the following year, it could be a windfall for us. So we're really just really not looking at this 5 year. As we look in our budgets, we're always looking down 5 years. It's more that we're looking at just this 1 year, and then it would really be the following year that we'd have to make a real decision if it didn't come our way and things started to produce, correct? With that?
Yeah, so to balance the budget for a year, it would be possible. Again, we could delay a capital project or so on, be able to maintain it, but it would, and that would be a 1 year thing. We'd be able to do it if, depending on what happens later on. Without the fiscal reform, it would also have the consequences that we would not be able to invest in some things. But yes, it's doable for 1 year. There's certain things that we would need to manage, but again, I think it is doable. Understanding that with that, and that's our role when we come and do the budget process, is to really explain, okay, because of this is the impact for this year of the things that we cannot do or we would need to delay.
Yeah, and I think, you know, I can't speak for all council. I can speak for myself, is that, you know, I understand tightening the belt for 1 year and wait and see, because, you know, when we do our budgets, we look at 5 years all the time. So 5 years back or 5 years ahead. So I think with this, we're being asked to not really look into a crystal ball, because we know what we're going to get next year from our tax assessment. It's the following year that we're going to have to look and see. So I think from my point of view, I'd be willing to, and even at budget, when people come forward and say, well, I'd like to put a little bit more money into this grant or into that grant, I will understand that this, to keep the vast majority of seniors that are on fixed income, or other people that are on fixed income, that we can keep their tax rate the way it is, I'd be willing to go along with that. So just to let you know.
Yeah, and just one thing to add as well, because this is really important. It's a message I would like council to get today. There's a possibility that the funds we get from the fiscal reform could completely make this conversation today almost null. You know what I mean? But there's also a possibility it won't. I don't know yet. So it's really just about setting it up. It's about letting council be able to absorb, because if we get a good portion of funding from the fiscal reform, maybe it won't necessarily impact. It will still have an impact, because certainly we will not be able to fund the amount of level 2s and level 3s that we normally do. But that being said, it could really mitigate if we receive, you know, because we're losing around, if we look at last year's number, it's around $13 million that we would have lost in terms of assessment if we got the assessment at the same level as last year. That being said, last year, council decided to reduce the tax rate. So we didn't even capitalize on the entire 13 million. So let's say we capitalized last year on 7 million, and we get 7 million from the fiscal reform, where pretty much where it's a budget as normal, right? Just there's some unknowns yet that we have to be prepared in the event that that fiscal payout from the fiscal reform, there's a shortfall of what we used to get before in assessment increases. So.
Yeah, and I think, to be fair, I think that, you know, from my way of thinking is that we would be able to explain that to the residents. So they would understand that also. So in 2026, 27, it could be different than what it is right away for next year. So, and I think that's important. So we'll have our assessment back. We'll know what the reform looks like, and we'll go from there. But anyway, that's mine. Thank you, Your Worship.
Merci, Conseiller Butler. Conseiller Léger.
Merci, Madame la Mairesse. Merci, Jacques.
Thank you very much, Your Worship and Jacques.
I understand the predicament we're in. I guess it's interesting because if I go back to, yes, we did give tax relief, but whether we like the growth or not, I think it's close to 85% of residences in the province of New Brunswick are under the 10% cap, which means that over the next, probably, as you said, as many as 7-8 years to catch up, the assessments are going to go up. So therefore, their rates are going to go up. I guess before making a decision, I mean, I'm not certainly happy that the city would just forego $2.5 million, or it's approximately what you're saying, somewhere in that vicinity in terms of the shortfall. But we don't know for sure because, as you said, there's an option that we could find ourselves getting funds that will offset. So what I would like to have is the conversation in and around what are the needs of the city right now. And it's not as simple as just holding off for a year. I look at Kodiak Transpo, for example, and I look at the necessary investments needed in that particular, I'll call it a business. And if you tell me, well, we could allocate money for that, but there's nothing we can do for a year because of supply chain and so on, that's one thing. But I think what would be useful would be to understand what are all the priorities that you have, and what are we asking, and when we look at it as council, do we put the burden on you to decide which capital projects and which items are cut, or do you come back to council and say, let's have this discussion, okay? And it might be, we can decide to defer that, but I think we should have the conversation in public. Because I think, we talked about that last year when we were, returning that difference to residents. And the topic was brought up in terms of, well, maybe we should reserve a cent, for example, for public transportation for the next while, or maybe we should, create a reserve based on that. And yet, no, we wanted to give it back. I understand everybody's under different pressures. But we're bearing a lot of the brunt of this as a municipality. And yet, on the other hand, the expectation is that we're, that we're growing and so on. So we need to have that discussion, because if we say, for example, perhaps we pause on all trails for the next while. We don't do anything with trails except for maintenance or whatever that is. I think it would be worthwhile to have that conversation. I appreciate the differential of 0, 2.5%, and so we can consider. But I think we have to do it that way. And we really have to have the list. What does this look like? And so if we've got a $2.5 million shortfall, what does that $2.5 million represent? You can offset it. I get it. But what is it that we're going to offset? And just be transparent in terms of that. Like, for example, if you were to tell me, or, we need to have the conversation, oh, well, I'm sorry, but we can't give that software technology that we so need for bylaw enforcement for the next year or two. I'd like to have that conversation to say, is that really acceptable? If there are new buses that we could get within the next 6 months, do we push that down the road for 6 months or a year? So I think if we could have that, I think it would be useful. I appreciate the uncertainties, and certainly we need to reflect too on perhaps the pace at which we're going to be reinvesting in our community. And maybe we're going to be faced with that. We have to slow down, and that's just the reality. And is that acceptable to everyone? not just one segment of population, but has to be acceptable to everybody. And then maybe we need to push the provincial government to say, well, look, just a minute now, if you want municipalities to grow and you have a large percentage of population on fixed income, well, then figure out what we need to do to protect the people on fixed income, okay? But at the end of the day, we still have to grow the city. And you're at a different perspective in life when you're in your 20s and 30s and 40s and working. And yes, things are going up, but the bottom line is you're keeping up and you're enjoying the services and what the city's delivering. Then all of a sudden you're in fixed income. You still enjoy those services, but the problem is you just don't have that affordability to say, I can work an extra couple of hours, do a few overtime shifts, and I can get the money. I think that's a conversation that we have to have. And I think that's where the province has to step up and figure out, okay, how are you going to, balance this out? Because otherwise it's always going to be that same conversation and it doesn't really get us somewhere. So anyway, if you have the ability or if the CEO has the ability to, those are conversations I think that we need to have. But again, just having that transparent list of things and let us talk about what it is that we're delaying, which is fine, but just so the general public realizes that as well, I think would be very useful.
Yeah, thank you, Your Worship, to Councilor Gier. Just to add to that, no, absolutely. And the one thing also as a reminder to council, when we, the biggest things that would get delayed if ever we have to balance the budget, it's your capital items. That is where it, and in capital, it's always important. There's two components. One is investing in your existing assets, right? Because again, if you have assets that are not providing the service levels that they're supposed to, it's one thing. The second thing is on the capital side, for the most part, normally we don't necessarily cancel projects, right? We just delay because they don't fit into the affordability. So, but on the capital, which is the bulk of our spending on our budgets, when we have to present it and it's the provincial form, the starting point is always what council approved as the 5-year last year. So you always see what the previous approval was and what the new. So by having that, there's always that conversation. And this year we could focus even more on the line items and say, okay, well, for this one, unfortunately, if it was a bus or if it was, and again, I don't think a new bus would make it because it hits all the strategic pillars, right? But anyways, but it would be okay. We had this approved for 2025 or 2026. Now it's delayed to 2027. And you would see that line of previous had funding and the new column does not, right? So, but we would certainly put a focus on that.
And I think it's helpful in terms of just everyone understanding how the decisions are made and for clarity. So thank you. Merci.
Merci, Conseiller Légère. No other questions. Merci beaucoup, Jacques. Excellente présentation. Merci. Madame.
It was a great presentation. Thank you very much. Madam Clerk now.
Online. So he asked to move it to the next committee of the whole. And that would be it.
C'est beau. Donc, what date?
July 21st.
Okay, c'est beau.
Yeah, 21st, no, July 28th.
Okay, c'est beau. Merci, Conseiller Richard. On va clore la réunion. C'est beau.
Okay, so then we can finish the meeting. Thank you very much. Adjourned.